Thanks so much, Rosalie, for inviting me to this really interesting day of conversations. My name is Sabina Uffer. I'm at BuroHappold, and we had an initiative during most of 2017 to host a series of design sprints, like a 4-hour workshops in cities across the world, from LA to Pittsburgh, to New York, London, Berlin, Kuala Lumpur, and Hong Kong. And the idea was really to bring together expertise from the car manufacturing and technology industry with expertise from urban planning, policymakers, to try and kind of teach each other what we're doing. And one of the early sprints was in Pittsburgh, and I still remember we had someone from a startup technology company who previously worked at Google's AV program, and he was like, yeah, I'm trying to figure out all day long how an AV is working its way through a snow day. I never really think what the impact is on urban planning and the city. And so that was really kind of like one of the incentives for which I really thought, like, we need to do this. We need to kind of talk to each other and actually understand what each other is doing. So the workshops really kind of try to get these people together and think of how can we actually reclaim the street, and how can we actually maybe move away from this discourse about the automobile and turn around the hierarchy and bring back the kind of the pedestrian, the playing kid, and the biker into the street. And so the question was really around how can urban streets be reclaimed in an era of autonomous and connected vehicles. And in my 5 minutes, I will really kind of just talk about 6 ideas that came out of these like 15 plus design sprints that we hosted, that were kind of ideas that were a common theme. And I have to say, those weren't actually the biggest and the craziest ideas, but those were the ideas that people felt they really they are implementable and they really want to work towards. But it was also ideas that we can implement right now. We don't necessarily need to wait for the era of autonomous and connected vehicles to start. But it was also in the context of having this technology coming into our cities. It might bring us a window of opportunity to really rethink the public space and urban realm. So the first one was, and it was interesting, and I come back to that point at the very end of this presentation. Depending on in which city the design sprint happened, the priorities were a little bit different. And especially in cities like Hong Kong or Berlin or London, where they have a really, really strong public transit system, they were all about defending their public transit system. They saw the autonomous vehicle as a threat to that, and they were thinking of solutions of how to integrate that. And so they did see the opportunity of autonomous vehicles as a kind of, and we've heard that this morning already, have a first mile, last mile connected, but only if it is done in a way that the integration is so seamless that you're not really feeling like you're doing a change. Because if you start to feel that there is a change between getting out of your car into public transit and you have to kind of have a new ticket or anything like that, you will kind of feel it is an inconvenience and you stay in the car. So it was really about kind of how to think that, and in that context, the idea of like mobility hubs came up where you could also pick up your Amazon package on the way. Why do we all think that we need to have the Amazon package delivered at home? If it's that convenient on your route to somewhere or from somewhere, it might be a much more efficient way to get you the package delivered. And then it was recognized that CRVs, in whatever form, and I think Anthony's presentation made it very clear that there are many different kind of forms of these vehicles. It can replace public transit at times and in locations where it might not be efficient. So nighttime or in the outskirts of the cities. The second idea that came up often was a more dynamic way of using the space, because often today the street is kind of designated to the car, but if it doesn't have heavy tidal flow, it's still designated to the car. But does the technology of actually connected vehicles allow us to think that there might be kind of times where in the afternoon where it's not really used by cars, can we then give it back to kids playing on the street? So that was, I think, a lot of participants were excited about this technology and started thinking about how to dynamically allocate spaces to different users, from retail to pedestrians to kind of different types of transit. Interestingly, the kind of dynamic pricing or the congestion pricing came most up in so these sprints were made in a way that there was a workshop and different teams competed for the best solution. But in London, kind of a city that has been living with congestion pricing for the last kind of 10, 12 years, every single team in the design sprint came up as their number one solution for dealing with CAVs was pricing. So they didn't question anymore that road pricing is part of the puzzle. And I thought that was really interesting. And it was acknowledged that kind of the technology could really do this much more dynamically. And there are a lot of issues, but around it that need to be figured out. But you can kind of the Uber search pricing, but you can also kind of acknowledge that there might be people who don't have necessarily alternative transport modes, who do need to use a car, that might not have to pay. So the kind of, because congestion charging often, at least the way it is implemented in cities, is quite static, and the technology would maybe allow for kind of a more dynamic way of pricing things. Then with kind of giving the kind of the hopes that governments really can regulate these things and can kind of overcome the political hurdles, the financial hurdles, people really got excited about trying to think about street hierarchies where you actually do have maybe more vehicles, where you have less, and really started thinking about what you could do with the street. And it was kind of really bringing up the need that there is for different types of storm management, removing the curb, using the public space and the street as a community asset. And then kind of the last two ideas is really about how to manage kind of these changes, and two things that came up all the time was the pick up and drop off. If you really move, and you can start seeing that with Uber and the ride services coming into our cities, there's really a need to rethink pick up and drop off. And even though we had a lot of urban designers at these workshops, I don't think anyone really came up with a solution that was satisfying to the participants. So there was a lot of instead of one lane, you have several lanes, and you have kind of these stops, and people can come and figure out which number they have to kind of get their car from, which number lane. But no one really could deal with, I think there wasn't really a solution for dealing with the high capacity issue that we're expecting. And then there was also the kind of thing of delivering at your package at the home. And as I said before, the idea came up of having a hub, potentially a neighborhood kind of post office where you're actually going and picking it up. Like Canada already has that. For actually picking up your mail. It isn't delivered to your home anymore. But also using curbside parking as a way to maybe get rid of curbside parking if you really don't need as much parking anymore. And then the question of parking was also heavily discussed in these workshops. And from kind of like the question of, do you have the parking in the city, high value land, but you might need some parking there, because otherwise you just have like vehicles coming in and out, and if they're empty, they're just kind of going empty out of the city and park in the outskirts. But then also from rethinking kind of parking as like maintenance garages, as like charging garages, and so on. And like, how do you, and I think Anthony brought some examples this morning about how do you creatively adapt parking structures in our cities. So that's really kind of the six ideas that each of the each of the cities, or that was a recurring theme in each of the city. But as I said before, I really think the context matter, and a city like Pittsburgh will have different opportunities and different risks with the CAV technology coming into their city. It can potentially be an alternative way to provide public transport, especially if you think of the ART system that we heard about this morning. If you think about more on-demand bus provision. And again, that's kind of different from Berlin or also from New York, where you have a very, very strong, especially in Berlin, a very strong public transit system. Car usership is somewhat limited, and you can actually see in Berlin that they're really like the public transit agency, basically the parallel of the MTA in Berlin, are now working and partnering with VIA, the kind of shuttle bus that we have also here in New York, to provide first and last mile connection to their system. And they're trying to, it's kind of their pilot project, and they're integrating it as the public transit agency. So they're taking it into their hands because they see it as a threat to their system. That's it.
Thank you, and thank you, Rosalie, for inviting me here. My name is Schaper. I'm a design director at Gensler, and I lead our urban strategies and design practice. What I put together for today is a series of projects that we've been doing over the past 4 to 5 years. And I think, incidentally, I grouped them chronologically almost. And they reach almost across the entire transect from cities to suburbia. And they're interesting in as much as there's a lot of parallels or connections to what we heard from Gabrielle about the history of the utopia. But also it's work that relates to not so much fueling the hype about autonomous vehicles, but think about the possibilities that the technology presents in other dimensions, especially as they are related to the public realm. I don't know if you saw recently, just last week, there was a collection of videos on LinkedIn circulating snapshots of New York in the first decade of the 20th century. And the commentary was astounding because it was all about the walkability of New York at the time. And of course it still is, but it was about how well-dressed the people are and how active they feel and how lean and healthy they all look like. And responses referred to the fact, well, we used to walk more than we do today. Of course, a very abbreviated statement, but I think New York City presents tremendous opportunities to explore the new technology, and especially not so much in focus of Manhattan, but also the outer boroughs. That could be a test bed for trying things out that are not easily tried out in other cities or in sort of regular settings. We've seen examples. The transformation of Times Square is obviously a great thing to point to. But I want to start with this project, which goes back to kind of a Gensler internal initiative called Town Square, or Rethinking the Town Square. The team in New York focused on unused spaces across Manhattan on medians. Turned out there's quite a bit of area that we don't really know what to do with. They're inaccessible, unused. The core of this idea went back to saying, can we develop a kit of parts of quickly delivered elements that enable local adjacent communities to orchestrate their block parties by ordering these elements through an app and have them delivered for a weekend party. Interestingly enough, this was just 4 to 5 years ago, and it was not driven by autonomous vehicles. Nobody talked about autonomous vehicles at the time. Just this year, we participate in the Beyond the Center Line competition, focused on Park Avenue, the stretch north of Grand Central, between Grand Central and 57th Street. As you see down in the picture below, I think, yep. Park Avenue actually used to be a park. It used to be a linear park that gave precedence to the pedestrian, and then over time transformed to the way we know it today. Interesting thing about Park Avenue is one of the few pure business districts in Manhattan that are empty after hours and empty on weekends. So what we said was, can we create a different interpretation of that street corridor as a smart street corridor to adjust the section of the street to the time of the day or the time of the week. And there's a UK company, can you not see it on the bottom? There's an Umbrellium that came up with these tiles that become digital surfaces designed for street surfaces that can literally create the condition for changing use, change the median to the left or the right side to give priority to northbound or southbound traffic, or on weekends take the median way and create super wide sidewalks to have kind of similar things happening that I mentioned with the Town Square Initiative project. But once we were there, we took it one step further to say, is there an opportunity to actually create a cruise up and down Park Avenue? And think about this as a cargo lifter, as a blimp with a transparent surface and a platform that can rise up and down, that docks in various stations. The round trip from 57th Street down to Grand Central and back is the equivalent of a rotation of the London Eye. And perhaps now that the Staten Island Ferris wheel is dead, maybe there's another opportunity to create something like this. But the interesting thing, or the interesting idea about this is that it activates the space in kind of like a spectacular, coincidental way that is kind of a coming together of known New York City attractions like the Staten Island Ferry and the cruise around Manhattan, all those kind of things. Of course, highly speculative, but it sort of speaks to the idea of placemaking and looking at street corridors that can be temporarily used for completely other purposes. Concerts on the weekend on Seagram Plaza, for example. Another project is our focus on the Bay Ridge branch line of Long Island Railroad. Of course, this alignment is also known as the Tri-Bar line, and I think we'll hear later today about this, and kind of the role that this took in RPA's 4th regional plan. When we started to look at this was a response to a transportation initiative by the Urban Design Forum. In its initial form, we called it the bike line. Trying to find sort of off-the-street grid alignments to create super bike highways in the outer boroughs, and at the same time find a reason to open up the space to the public, which is actually quite a beautiful linear park. Of course, it's an active freight line. Of course, there are freight rail happening today and increasingly in the future, but we saw a possibility of coordinating multiple modes of transportation within that corridor. And we studied this with our friends at Mobility and Shane to see what the impact is to create a multimodal connectivity across the grain of the subway lines that lead into Manhattan, which was our main criticism at the time to the Tri-Bar interpretation of just being an additional subway line. We called it the BQXL. No coincidence to say like it's the completion of the BQX, which just runs on the waterline, creates a complete loop and connects Brooklyn and Queens. And then moving into a suburban example, this is a development that we did a concept design for earlier this year, and we're embarking now into design development and construction documents for a townhouse development in Ontario called EVE Park, EVE being the acronym for Electronic Vehicles Enclave. And it was the opportunity to completely rethink the paradigm of the suburban street the way we saw it in the introductory lecture, Radbury being kind of that interesting hybrid between preference to pedestrians on one side and cars to the other side. Here, these circular buildings have a half-open courtyard. Vehicles actually park sort of self-park in one end of this, but these vehicles give priorities to pedestrians. They stop when someone crosses the street, and you start living in a park. And of course, the organizing the townhouses by size allows us to kind of bring the buildings down to the ground and avoid the kind of adjacencies that you have in a traditional suburban paradigm where you have just buildings facing each other, to more play with the idea of an active landscape. And then just a few examples where this idea of the possibilities of the technology also plays into kind of threshold spaces and also into buildings that we've been seeing. The infrastructure built for the car may be largely obsolete. One of the things that we start doing, collaboration with Reebok, Get Pumped, turning gas stations in the future to workout opportunities and healthy living spots. And then, of course, the impact on traditional parking garages, meaning the organization of the conventional parking garage for autonomous vehicles will allow us to reduce the amount of space, but also if we design it right, and the lower right corners are kind of the recommendations for that, flat floor plates rather than slanted floor plates. In theory, allows buildings that have office on the top, parking in the middle, retail on the ground floor, with the opportunity to grow the office space down into the parking when the parking demand is reduced in the future. This is an actual project. Our client basically said it pencils out for us to do this because in the future, expecting to grow significantly, a future expansion on a neighboring lot or vertically turn out to be more expensive than within the building. The other interesting aspect of this project is that the management of the parking space, as long as it exists, is by a non-profit developer. And it's a model that works, and we built the project. What you see here is that the facade actually covers the entire building, not just the office floors. Ground floor retail and then 3 floors of parking that are built as if you would move into a warehouse that was built for a different purpose. And then the model in Los Angeles is another example, which is more like a 1960s idea, of course, of creating ready-made modules to slide them into a parking garage, but mentioned here because of the opportunity to extend public space into a hyper-park situation, into sort of urban oasis, playing to the idea that parking garages are in fact applicable to future different uses. And then the discussion about these threshold situations of drop-off where sort of the space requirements for conventional drop-off can be reduced and organized in different ways if you think about autonomous vehicles. So there's a big design potential here. We've seen this similar image also. Incheon International Airport sort of focuses on a lot of people space and green space and park to replace the kind of extensive infrastructure that was used in the past for parking. And of course, the infrastructure itself that enables us to interact with the future of car sharing, ride sharing, and autonomous vehicles. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for the invitation and for your participation and paying attention in a long day full of great information. I'm Amina Hassen. I'm a senior urban planner at WXY Architecture and Urban Design, which is an integrated architecture, urban design, urban planning practice in New York City. And I'm going to jump right in, if I can get the clicker. So as we've been talking about today, and especially in the previous, the first half of the day, transportation is in transition. What we know is that transportation sectors are responsible for 90% of the greenhouse gas emissions in New York City, and 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions in New York City, and over 90% of those greenhouse gas emissions are directly related to on-street transportation and primarily personal automobiles. And so that's what I'm going to focus on today, is that transition to electric vehicles as a great opportunity in New York City. And I'm going to investigate a little bit by presenting one project that we've been working on to understand what that means for how we organize our city streets. So annual EV sales and registrations have been increasing nationwide, but also in New York City. There has been 168% growth in passenger EVs year over year for the past 4 years in New York City. There's over 30 electric vehicle and plug-in hybrid electric vehicle models in New York City. There are state and federal rebates that are increasingly making electric vehicles a smart choice and an economic choice for average consumers, whereas previously they were cost prohibitive. So all trends are pointing towards an increase in electrification across New York City and also in New York State. But still, we're at this point where there's a critical barrier to the successful large-scale adoption of electric vehicles in New York City in particular, and metropolitan areas that are similar in profile to New York City. And that's largely due to an issue of space and an issue of the fact that there's no public access electric vehicle charging stations. And that presents a perceptual barrier for consumers to make the shift to electric vehicles. If they don't see the infrastructure, then they might be afraid that they won't be able to complete their trip on a charge. And in New York City, where most people park their vehicles on street rather than in garages or parking lots, it's a logistical barrier. If you live in an apartment building, a multifamily apartment building, or if you live in a brownstone, you don't have access to private parking spots, so how would you charge your vehicle? So for the past year, we've been working with a few folks in the room, city, public sector policymakers and stakeholders, and private sector stakeholders to investigate what it will take to bring charging stations to New York City on street. And just as a note, there are 3 kind of typical levels of charge for electric charging stations. There's a level 1 that essentially you can plug into your home, charge overnight. It takes a very long time, and that's suitable for residential context. There's level 2, which is what we focus on. It will charge a typical vehicle in 4 to 8 hours of charge time. And then there's the DC or direct current fast charging stations that can charge a vehicle in under 30 minutes, but have a much heftier power requirement for that charge to happen. So I'm focusing on level 2 charging stations. And what we were looking at in this study is how the targeted deployment of curbside charging stations. And so when I say curbside, I mean on street, on the curbs, next to the parking spaces on street. How we can start to pair the charging stations where people live and where they drive and where they work, so that we can start to build out a public access network for New York City. So our study really consisted of 2 core parts. The first part was building out a planning framework. And so in this section, we really looked at how can we look at what's happening now, trends in EV adoption currently, and develop planning principles for a citywide rollout of electric charging stations, and build out a framework for identifying potential high utilization areas for the deployment. And we came up with 6 planning principles that we tried to abide by in the planning framework practice. One, to support multiple user groups and use cases, so to think through a 24-hour day, who are the users going to be? Is it a resident charging overnight? Is it a commuter? Is it a visitor to a store? Replace internal combustion vehicle miles traveled with zero-emission vehicle miles traveled. This is really the tricky part. And the map that we show here is one of the strategies that we developed to address that. And by targeting existing drivers, car-dependent commuters who rely on their vehicle because they don't live in proximity to public transportation or because they work second and third shift hours where public transportation is not readily available. We're hoping to target those neighborhoods where they drive to the clusters of hospitals and university institutions where they work that are also nestled within medium-density residential neighborhoods, so that you can target, kind of hit 2 birds with 1 stone, catch the commuters and the residents for charging. And then we got a little bit closer, so we started at the city scale and the regional scale thinking about the framework, and then we start to get down to the neighborhood level and the street level and wanted to identify which street types in New York City can actually support this type of new infrastructure. We arrived at 4 opportunities, street types, local streets that might primarily service multifamily residential neighborhoods, have lower volume of traffic. Spur streets that you're seeing here, that typically a local street won't have any metering, any paid metering, but oftentimes a New York City Department of Transportation will have a commercial main street will be metered, and then the intersecting local street will have metering 3 or 4 spaces in, or the length of the building's frontage. And by taking strategies where there's existing regulation and placing charging stations on those street types, it helps to reinforce charging station turnover, and it also builds in a good opportunity for multiple users. So you could imagine in this situation, maybe in the daytime, it would be short trips, visitors to the commercial frontage on the neighborhood main street, and then in the evening, when you're not restricted by a 2 or 4 or 6-hour meter, then it could turn over to residential charging. So I'm going to go quickly through some of our other slides. We thought a lot about how you fit a new street furniture element into all of the other things that are already on the sidewalk and the curb. And so you have to compete with existing street furniture elements, tree pits, building entrances and exits, pedestrians. And then we went down to the scale of trying to understand and future-proof this infrastructure. So if you're bringing power to the curb, what other benefits can that confer to the public? And there are a lot of opportunities here. There are opportunities for modular lighting elements. There's opportunities for smart city infrastructure. There are opportunities for improvements in plaza design and green infrastructure. And so I included this rendering, even though it was from a different project, just to show what that opportunity might look like right here. We're standing in this building right in the corner. And so very quickly, the last thing that I want to go through is a collective that I co-founded with a group of other Black and brown urban planners, architects, urbanists, and designers in New York City. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because representation matters. And it's especially important when we're talking about the history of transportation interventions and how those new interventions and new technologies have affected communities of color and Black and brown communities in particular. And so we're working together to make sure that Black and brown planners are represented and that the folks that are making decisions, policymakers, architects, designers, are reflective of the communities that they're planning for. Thank you.
I think I'm the last speaker today, so thank you for making it this far, and thank you to Rosalie and the Architecture League for the invitation to participate in this really interesting discussion. So my name is Hassen and Frampton. My practice, Only If, is together with my partner, Carolina Chomchak, and we're actually a very small office working at many different scales, from kind of small interiors to housing to kind of large-scale urban design, research and speculation. And I think that we're maybe exceptional, at least today, as being a very small office interested in big questions of transportation and infrastructure, and a desire to kind of participate in that. As a kind of, so we lived in Hong Kong before moving to New York about 5 years ago and starting Only If, and I point this out not just to be autobiographical, but I think the experience of living there, one can't help but be kind of continually impressed by the density and the sort of efficiency of the kind of hyper-capitalist city of Hong Kong, especially in comparison to the inefficiency of our public transportation. And in fact, Hong Kong's public transportation ridership share is 90%, the highest in the world, and in fact even higher than New York's target for 2050, 30 years from now. And so we see it perhaps as a model to achieve this, the goal of kind of decarbonization. And sort of in the interdisciplinary spirit and agenda of this program, one of our interests is the kind of relationship between urban form and its kind of social and economic and technological milieu. And I think that, like many here, I would argue that transportation and technology alone can't really address the immense challenge of the 5,000-pound life. So looking at Hong Kong's kind of urban form, I think one is struck at street level, if it can be called that there's a kind of lack of traditional urban legibility. There's sort of no street here. And in fact, these ideas of many of the traditional binary oppositions that we use to talk about the city, like above, below, figure ground, inside, outside, public, private, and sort of quotidian and futuristic, are either kind of blurred or collapsed in Hong Kong. And so there's sort of a very unique form of kind of three-dimensionality of public space in Hong Kong. And so together with co-authors Jonathan Solomon and Clara Wong, this is a book that we published about 6 years ago called Cities Without Ground, a Hong Kong guidebook. It's kind of a not really an architectural urban history. It's not even really a guidebook in the sense that you might use it for kind of wayfinding. It's simply about the city, Hong Kong, and the kind of spatial conditions that the three of us who were living there at the time found really interesting. And so the book is actually consists of 32 maps showing the kind of it's a kind of three-dimensional Noli plan of the layered public space, publicly accessible space, including subway platforms and pedestrian overpasses and underpasses and shopping mall atriums and hotel lobbies. And so just to kind of briefly take you through some of the maps, this is Shun Tak Center, which functions as a kind of sort of intermodal switch between tram, subway, bus, ferry, helicopter, taxi, etc. This is the West Kowloon, including the XRL train station to high-speed train to Beijing that was under construction at the time that we drew the kind of map. And each of the sort of parts of the system, these networks take on actually very different types and kind of forms, including the sort of verticality of the Kowloon Tong shopping mall here. And so looking at a kind of detail, one sees the kind of layers, but also the kind of contradictions of the system. The labels point to these kind of activities and events that, and the kind of circulation networks that really make Hong Kong's public transportation work. And so although a significant portion of it is privately owned, it's in fact, we consider it public space. That was kind of what we were told at the time, or what we heard at the time, is that Hong Kong has no public space. But I think here it happens, and it doesn't maybe necessarily resemble what we think of as public space, but it functions as such. So we indeed see, kind of, I think Hong Kong could be a kind of model of a city that sustains new ways of moving. So coming back to New York, last year we had the opportunity to work with the Regional Plan Association. This is we were focused on one of 4 teams. Our team, together with One Architecture, a Dutch urban design and resiliency consultancy, we were focused on the kind of tri-borough. So this is a portion that Oliver was speaking to earlier. And just I think many of you in this room may know about the important role in the growth of the region in the future. And increasingly, given the unaffordability of the kind of center in Manhattan, and I was really interested to hear this morning from Jennifer that actually 80% of the transportation-related emissions are coming from the kind of outer boroughs. And so I think you saw under the previous administration that a lot of the innovations in transportation, like City Bikes, the High Line, were sort of focused on Manhattan. So the idea is here to look to the outside. And of course, the tri-borough is a kind of idea that's been around before us. It was a kind of given. Its shape is related to this series of underutilized existing freight tracks. And this was the kind of given. So they're owned by different sort of entities. And so the tri-borough, our proposal is to kind of dual purpose the existing freight and inner city lines to connect Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx. And I think more importantly, what it does is turns New York City from a kind of hub and spoke system into one that has this kind of radial connection, a circumferential spatial relationship between areas that were previously very hard to kind of get to, and for which Uber and these other ride-sharing technologies have been filling the gaps lately. So, one could envision that, for instance, during the upcoming L shutdown, that the tri-borough produces kind of resiliency in the system to allow people to kind of traffic to kind of redirect and move around when one part fails. So more than just transportation, I think we wanted to think about what this would, number one, how this would happen, and then number two, kind of what it would do. And so we looked at the kind of existing condition, which is in fact like a kind of an exquisite corpse that cuts through every imaginable condition in New York City. Sunken, elevated, at grade, et cetera. And the tri-borough, of course, it's not just a physical transect, but it's also many different diverse communities and social and economic demographics. And so the question becomes, who participates in and profits from the kind of improved connectivity, the increased livability, and the new kind of development opportunities, and how can we avoid or mitigate the negative impacts of this new transportation system and keep, in a way, keep some of these communities, existing and diverse communities, intact. And so our project consists of like 3 different layers to kind of describe how it would happen. I'll focus on one, but basically to summarize, like some of them are kind of, we saw it as partially a kind of public project. We saw it as then another part of it is a kind of public-private project, and then there's also the kind of private project. This is the public-private layer, which is actually 25 new stations that kind of provide these like intermodal connections between the new passenger service with subway, train, bicycles, and kind of other current and future forms of mobility. And so what we did was we created a drawing of the entire thing. And just to take you through it from kind of left to right from Brooklyn, so, you see like some of the stations starting with the Brooklyn Army Terminal are more kind of complex. Those are the stations, these are the kind of nodes where the infrastructure would require resolution between many layers and therefore require more significant investment. And then other stations are actually much more simple, as you see here, like Avenue I, Avenue H, which are really just kind of outdoor kind of platforms. The more complex kind of infrastructural nodes all take on different kinds of programs. I won't describe all of them, actually, but the idea was that they would kind of catalyze certain kind of economic sectors. They would be combined with spot upzoning. And they would create new relationships and proximities between the kind of workforce and workplaces. So and our focus was on, in a way, like the sectors, economic sectors that are not centered in Manhattan, but in fact, like education, healthcare, manufacturing, logistics, and food. And so we studied the kind of, these sort of nodes, but also the kind of in-between spaces. This is another layer of the project, which is the kind of public project, which creates a 24-mile long linear park using the, in most cases, the existing right-of-way. And so it would become, a park, recreational area, et cetera. In other moments, where the train track is elevated in Astoria approaching the Triborough Bridge, we use this kind of underside of the arched elevated structure, to create also kind of new forms of public space. And that's it. Thank you.
We'd love to hear from you, but so think about your questions. Maybe, so we have the title here, the architectural response. I would be curious, I actually maybe if I could start by asking a question to Gabrielle, and then maybe give you guys a chance to kind of collect. But it was amazing to hear that this sort of whistle-stop tour through these various kinds of projects. And what struck me each time was the totally ideologically, the like resolve around the righteousness of each project, like the kind of belief is what I mean about each one. So that there was a kind of, there was an understanding of the issue, but then also a kind of commitment to each project. So I guess I'm wondering, how do we, if part of the idea that we learned from these projects in the past, what do we learn from that, like in our own current moment around the kind of enthusiasm, skepticism spectrum about these large projects? To what extent can we maybe take something from that historical imagination of each of these projects?
I think that what comes to the fore, and particularly after these excellent presentations that give us a way of framing the kind of contemporary moment in relation to the past, what strikes me is to be committed. I think one of the things that happens in the middle of the 20th century has to do with larger perceptions about hierarchies of practice and where professionals should be spending their time and what the proper domain of professional designers is. In the middle of the century, in the middle of the last century, that was constantly being debated. And I think that, there was a polemic around convincing designers to spend time dealing with the intersections of architecture and planning in the spaces of the automobile, because there was so much pressure professionally to spend time at the center, that the center was the only thing that mattered. And I think, now obviously a lot of our conversation today has been about the center, but I think one of the things that also becomes clear is that we all have a more sophisticated understanding of what the quote-unquote city is. Even just the attention being paid to the so-called outer boroughs, outer according to who, other than just their kind of physical geography. So I think that kind of commitment to regard taking on autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles as a subject of design is really important, and not just kind of doing it for a while because it's something that is of the moment, but recognizing that design practitioners need to be in this in the long term, because if y'all don't do it, it's going to happen anyway. I think that's the really important thing, that there has to be a commitment to it. And the tension, of course, is that we know that designers are only responsible for such a small percentage of the built environment. So how to kind of expand that percentage at this critical moment.
I mean, maybe that almost is like that's almost like a segue to a question to the four presentations because I mean, it was really exciting to see the spectrum of work. And that was kind of exactly my question, how do you expand access? And so I wonder if you would, even though it's, again, this kind of like, I mean, it would be nice to be able to eventually have a conversation, but maybe it's a starting point to hear, I'd love to hear from each of you about your thoughts on the I don't know, like the one thing that you see as either opportunity or obstacle to getting involved. Like what's the path to implementation, let's say?
Yeah, I think implementation is a really good way of thinking that, because I was struck too about the balance and the tension between speculative work that seems, some of which seems to have come from within your disparate practices, but some of which is also responding to opportunities that are out there. So that tension between speculation and implementation.
Maybe I try an answer from my perspective. I think there are several realities that we as design professionals are exposed to today, and one is the role of design as a discipline itself. I think we heard a lot of the examples that you described where designers and architects appeared as the person who would proclaim the big solution and be convinced about that this is the way to go. I think we went through kind of a period of delusion after that this is actually a very strange thing to do and very non-smart way to operate. And at the same time, the design discipline has now come back to embrace more than architecture and form making and more be of a facilitator of an interdisciplinary conversation. Which I think is at the heart of where the opportunity really is with the advent of like changes in transportation and the possibilities of that presents itself. So I think with this, the responsibility of us as designers reaches clearly into kind of leading this discussion from that perspective of being a facilitator, and point out the opportunity that that the technology presents itself, because as you stated correctly, if we don't do it, then it will happen, but it will happen without the set of priorities that we would like to set, that we see as important to create the kind of public realm that we all want. So I think. And the lessons learned, I think, from the past is, again, I think just this idea of the cautionary principle and acknowledging the fact that it's a very, in a sense, a very messy environment, and there are no recipes, there are no prefabricated answers. A lot of what we do, in a sense, from that perspective, is trial and error, and see and observe and be nimble enough to change our conclusions and focus on other things. And I think our role is both responding to what we do as a client service and getting paid for it, as well as contributing to the discussion from a sort of more independent level of observing and synthesizing and so on.
I think one of the things that struck me about what you said earlier was the perfectibility. And I think that a lot of times when you're approaching a project, or when we've been approaching a project in the office from a planning perspective, you're trying to find the solution. But it's a dialogue, it's a give and a take, and it's trial and error. And the next step for the Curb Enthusiasm project is actually working with the city to take the approach that we've drafted and to start to implement it and to start to learn from that implementation and to understand if our hypotheses about utilization actually pan out, and if our hypotheses about street types that can support new street furniture actually pan out. And it has to be a conversation that is between the private sector and public sector. It has to involve the city, and it also has to involve the design community outside of architects. When we're talking about a new piece of street furniture, it's, well, what are the design standards that we want for them, and how does it impact the public space? And so it's kind of like a constant conversation that moves between scales from the street, from the pieces of the infrastructure to the city, to the region, and back down again in trial and error. And I think that that's part of the process that we recognize that has to be part of the process to get to a solution that we want.
So I'm not a designer, but I think I agree with what has been said already, that I think acknowledging that design is only part of the solution, and that it needs to be interdisciplinary, but it also needs to acknowledge that, especially in this day and age, we need to constantly adapt, and being able to adapt and not taking anything for the truth. I think that's what I would say is my hope for designers.
Yeah, I think I can't really disagree with anything that's been said, but I've kind of been thinking all day about, especially after seeing a lot of these kind of visionary projects, like dealing with the kind of automobile through the history, like in the 20th century. Like, I really wonder, like, yeah, what is our role as designers? And I think there's kind of this, the euphoria, I think was your term for the kind of autonomous vehicle, and I wonder, how can we use our own, sort of disciplinary knowledge and expertise at this moment in time to do more than just kind of illustrate or anticipate these technologies, and how is it going to affect, urban form actually, and how can we reclaim, maybe how can we not be too humble, and because, it was also like this experience of kind of working on the 4th regional plan. We were like looking back a lot at the 2nd regional plan, which was a moment of, very much kind of top-down urban planning. There was an idea that, the city form could be controlled and shaped, and that was actually the moment when New York City made its last master plan, right? 1969. We don't have a master plan. It's the kind of neoliberalism that now shapes the kind of city, and so I'm not sure I have the answer, but I wonder, like, how do we do more than just kind of, the decoration for new technologies that are emerging.
Maybe I could follow up to that statement with an effort to make some connections between the morning, it was the morning. Maybe it was yesterday. I think we heard from Mimi about these 4 schematic, but maybe not too, but all too sort of real scenarios about one way of seeing what could happen. And I guess, to Adam, your point, I could imagine one follow-up question would be, how do we avoid unwittingly producing the fortress city or the fast city or the digital city? Or, to some extent, the livable city was like the sort of least worst of those 4 in a way. But I guess I'm curious about, and the questions that came up about spatial justice and environmental justice. How do those fit into some of the things that you're all trying to do? We saw some of it, I think, through what you were talking about, Amina, and I think it's implicit in a lot of things. But I wonder if that question of how to ensure that there's that bigger perspective, so that one isn't unwittingly just rolled into the kind of structure that you're describing, these kind of economic systems that then drive so much of the things we're asked to do.
What I found interesting about a lot of the work that you were presenting was a kind of insistent incrementalism, right? That there are each of these stages, and you're kind of taking a project sort of at each moment, thinking about how far you can develop an idea at a given stage of the project. But I wonder, what's the if we think about this in a kind of marketing way, because that's the power of images. What's the image that's going to be transformative in the public's mind? Like a fortress city, and that image of the long lines building is very powerful. I wonder if like in the work that you're doing, what makes it legible in a way?
I'm not sure if I have a direct answer to this, but while you were elaborating, I thought one concrete example of what I mentioned earlier in terms of us presenting ideas in response to the economic environment that we're operating in, and specifically a client asking us to do something very specific, is that we, especially within the urban design, urban planning arena, now always work with a group of analysts in-house that will make us more literate about the economic impact of the ideas that we're producing in response to like social challenges or environmental challenges, for example. So we're not anymore exposed to the idea of someone saying, this is a great idea, but it's high-flying and it's not relevant and we can't pay for it. Because more often than not, we realize that this space we are operating in is one that's not tested and there are no precedents. We were creating new markets with proposing some of the more outward or visionary ideas that we have. And at the same time, we realized that we need to back this up and say, here's the complete picture, so that the kind of, let's say, naivete that the architectural profession sometimes is looked at with is taken out of the picture. And I think we've been successful in a number of occasions to push the limits and push the boundaries and be persistent in asking questions that we could have not asked before operating in this way. So I think there's a fundamental difference in the role of us as designer, and my suspicion is that the future of the profession will stretch much more in that direction. So I think it will be more like more a social entrepreneurial activity than a pure design activity.
Yeah, in a lot of the projects throughout the office, whether it's a build project or just a planning project, we really prioritize meaningful forms of public engagement and public engagement that can actually influence and change design. And not as a formulaic, okay, we got them, we attended the meeting, but a dialogue and a conversation, because especially if we're talking about civic space, public space, if we're talking about people's parking that they're very sensitive about, you have to have it become a conversation, and it can be a visionary exercise where you think about the ideal future, or it can be a very practical exercise where you work through short-term prioritization. But in either of those cases, I think that building in meaningful opportunities for public engagement is one way that you can start to get, well, I guess safeguard you against some of those the dangers of the visionary architect operating alone.
Fighting for a parking spot. Have you heard that Alex Baldwin got arrested yesterday for a fist fight over a parking spot?
No, but I'm not surprised.
He was trying to charge his EV, I think.
I think it's interesting because what both of you bring up, and working in practices that are very different scales, I think that's interesting too. We have folks in whose offices are very different in size, is kind of thinking about how you qualify and quantify what counts as kind of expertise and information. And so you have in-house analysts. You get your analysts are stakeholders out there, and so it becomes really interesting in terms of thinking about the gathering of the specialized knowledge, which somehow the design profession now in particular believes it needs. So you bring this expertise in. How does one convince tech folk and transportation folk that designers have specialized knowledge that is equally important as we're thinking through the emergence of these new forms? That's a big question.
I think I would add, though, because the scenario of the smart city, I'm very afraid of it, but at the same time, there are good things coming out of smart city, and I think playing to that point of like, how do we use the expertise and become more analytical as designers? I think there are lots of things that we can kind of embrace from that point.